In this lecture, you're going to learn how to work with SQLite in Python. SQLite is a very lightweight database that we use for storing data of an application. It's often the technology of choice for small applications like the apps that we run on phones and tablets. So it allows us to easily store our data in a structured format, like a table of rows and columns. So let's start by importing the SQLite 3 module. Now, in the last lecture, we created this movies.json file. So let's go ahead, read all the movies from this JSON file and store them in our SQLite database. So back in app.py, we should also import the JSON module. And from the pathlib module, we should import the path class. Now, we create a path object to load movies.json file. Read all its content. This will give us a string, so we can pass that to json.loads, and this will give us the list of movies. Now, before going any further, let's print this movies object and see if everything is working up to this point. So let's run the application. Beautiful, so we have a list of dictionaries. All right, now we want to store this list in a database. So this SQLite object has a method called connect. We pass the name of our database file here. Let's call it db.sqlite3. We could call it anything, it doesn't matter. Now, if this file doesn't exist, this method will create it for us. So it will return a connection object. This connection object, similar to files, should be closed when we're done with it. So a better approach is to use the with statement and then get the connection here. Next, we need to create a command. This command is basically the instruction we send to the database for creating data, updating data, deleting it, and so on. Quite often, we use a language called SQL that is beyond the scope of this course, so if you're not familiar with it, don't worry. It's pretty easy to learn. In fact, it's far easier than Python. So here's an example. I'm going to create a command and set it to a string like this. Insert into movies. So I'm assuming we have a table called movies where we store all our movies. Then we add values, parentheses, and in parentheses I add 3 question marks separated by a comma. So these question marks are placeholders for the values that we're going to supply in the next step. So our table of movies will have 3 columns: ID, title, and year. So next, we need to iterate over our movies list. That is pretty easy. For movie, in movies. Now we need to execute this command. So we use our connection object. This has a method called execute. As the first argument, we pass our command. And as the second argument, we need to pass the actual values. So each movie object in this for loop is a dictionary. It has key value pairs like ID, title, and year. All we want here is the actual values. So we call movie.values. Now we need to get these values and put them in a tuple. So we use the built-in tuple function like this. So here we're iterating over our movies list. For each movie, we execute this command. When we're done, we should call connection.commit. At this point, all these changes will be written to the database. Let's save the changes. Now, if we run this program, we're going to get an error. Let me show you. So, there you go. Operational error, no such table, movies. Because here we're dealing with an empty database, this database doesn't have any tables. So we need to create the movies table first. Here on Google, if you search for DB browser for SQLite, you will find this website, SQLitebrowser.org. On this website, you can find an application to open a SQLite database and look at its content. As you can see on the right side, we have executables for various operating systems. So go ahead and download the right executable for your operating system. When you open DB browser, you're going to see something like this. So on the top, let's go to Open Database. Here in our project directory, let's open our database file. There you go. So as you see, we don't have any tables here. Let's go ahead and create a table. We're going to call that movies. And then we need to add 3 fields or 3 columns to it. So add field. The first one is ID. The type of this column should be integer. And we're going to mark this as primary key, which means we're going to use the value of this column as a unique identifier for each movie. You want to make sure each movie has a unique ID. Okay? Now let's add another field. We're going to call that title. The type of this column should be text. And finally, another field. We're going to call that year. Once again, the type of this is going to be integer because here we're going to store values like 1984. So this is how we create a table. As you can see, that's pretty easy. Let's go ahead. Okay. Now in the list of tables, we have this movies table. If you expand it, you can see all its columns. Looks like I made a mistake here. So the name of my third column is field 3, not year. So let's select the table, go to modify table here, and then rename this column or field to year. Now press tab to make sure that the changes are applied. By the way, we also have this column here. If we tick these checkboxes, we're telling SQLite that the data in this column cannot be null. In other words, we cannot have a movie without a title or without a year. So it's better to check this as well. We don't have to check not null for the ID field because when we select a column as the primary key, SQLite will make sure that every row will have a value for that column. All right, let's go ahead. Okay, we're almost done. Now we need to click Write Changes. Beautiful. So back to our program. Let's run it one more time. Okay, this time we didn't get an error. So back to DB browser. Now if you select the movies table and go to browse data, you can see both our movies ended up here. They're stored in a structured format. So we have a table with columns and rows. It's beautiful. Now let me show you how to read data from this database. So we don't need line 5 anymore because we're done with this JSON file. To read data from a database, first we need to connect to it. So we're going to keep line 5, but we're going to change line 6. So instead of inserting a movie into the movies table, we're going to select all the movies. The command that we should write is select star from movies. Now, we don't need to iterate over the movies object. We simply need to execute this command. So connection.execute, we pass the command, and this will return a cursor. So when we read data from a database, we'll get a cursor. Let's store that here. A cursor is an iterable object. So we can iterate over it and get one row at a time. For row in cursor, let's simply print row. And we don't need connection.commit because we only need this when writing data to a database. So delete, save the changes, run the program. You can see in each iteration, we get a tuple of the values for a row in our database. We also have this method, so cursor.fetch all, that will return all the rows in this table in one go. So here we'll get a list, let's call that movies, and then print it on the terminal. Now, if we run this, we're not going to get any result because after we iterate over this cursor, we'll get to the end of the cursor, so we won't be able to read it again. So I'm going to comment out these 2 lines, save the changes, and run the program. Now, as you see, we get a list of tuples. So this is the basics of working with SQLite databases in Python. As I told you before, when working with databases, you should also be familiar with the SQL programming language. That is beyond the scope of this course, but there are plenty of tutorials online, and it's really easy to learn.